So I'm Pete Kirby Miller. I am a teacher naturalist here in Montpelier at North Branch Nature Center. Hang on. And yeah, most of my time I spend teaching nature connection classes with local public school classes, but in the spring I get to put on my scientist hat and run this amphibian road crossing program and get folks excited about amphibians in their backyards and in the roadside ditches and just get folks out there and involved. So tonight we're going to be focusing on amphibians. These are our frogs, our toads, and our salamanders, and I'll give an overview of their natural history, what's exciting about these amphibians, and then we'll close with some really practical advice and ways to be involved in this amphibian road crossing community science program that we do at the Nature Center here, and that folks up in your neighborhood are doing collaboratively with us for a big event. So yeah, we'll start with just amphibians. These are frogs, toads, and salamanders. And if you'll humor me for just a minute, amphibian comes from two Greek words, amphi, which is the same root as like ambi, meaning both, like ambidextrous, and bios, meaning life, because they have both an aquatic phase and a terrestrial phase. We're most familiar, perhaps, with the terrestrial phase. Here's a salamander, a spotted salamander. And on land, they become top predators. This one from this angle looks like a dragon, and that is probably exactly how a slug or a bug, a springtail, or an ant would see it. They're top predators in the leaf litter, eating anything that'll fit in their mouths. And yeah, and their larval phase is pretty much the same. They're the top predators of these vernal pools, but they're eating different sorts of invertebrates. They're eating fairy shrimp and copepods, amphipods, and the larval forms of dragonflies and a lot of flying insects that we're familiar with. And it's that ability to have both that terrestrial phase and that aquatic phase that really is unique to amphibians. And that's that strategy of always being a metaphorical big fish in a little pond is central to their life history. And it also makes for an interesting conservation problem, because you're not just worried about forest habitat, you're also worried about wetland, and you're worried about everything in between those two. But for now, let's turn out our window and think about where our amphibians are right now. So here in Montpelier, we're starting to see some bare ground, but there are other places where there are almost 2 feet of snow still. And under those 2 feet of snow, and then maybe under just a few leaves or just a tiny bit of dirt, you'll have almost exposed frogs. Now, these frogs, spring peepers and wood frogs, they overwinter they're freeze tolerant. And they're tolerant of freezing because they flood their bodies with a natural antifreeze that they produce. Now, this doesn't prevent them from freezing. So I guess antifreeze is sort of a misnomer, but it prevents ice crystals from becoming large. So if our flesh was to freeze, ice crystals would form and then rupture our cell walls. And then when our flesh thawed out, our tissue would die. We'd get frostbite, gangrene, and we'd be in really rough shape. But these wood frogs and spring peepers are flooding their bodies with a natural antifreeze to keep ice crystals in their body that form in the winter small, so that they're not disrupting cell membranes. So if you were to find a spring peeper today, it might be as hard as an ice cube, but it's doing just fine under there. And since these animals are cold-blooded, their metabolism relies on the external temperature rather than their internal metabolic rate. They're in like very, very slow motion. They're essentially burning 0 calories and consuming 0 oxygen through the winter. Now, the amphibians pictured here, we have a spotted salamander and a blue spotted salamander, have a different strategy for overwintering. They are not freeze tolerant, they're freeze avoidant. So they're crawling down way below the ground, below the frost line. So this is like 4 feet plus. Basically, you can think of where these salamanders start to overwinter as the place where you'd start to think about installing a root cellar. it's the same idea. We're keeping our potatoes fresh by keeping them away from freezing by burying them underground. So they're 4, 6, 8 feet below ground, and they're reaching those depths by following the burrows of rodents and cracks along tree roots. So they're down there. The ground is very cold, still 33, 34 degrees, but it's not frozen. And this figure will come back later as we start to think about what's moving when and what's causing them to move. But first, we're going to meet a couple characters. Now, we have a lot of different amphibians throughout the state, but I've condensed it to just three different species that we'll use as like representations of different life histories that we can use to think about amphibians as a whole. And the first one is perhaps the best mascot of this amphibian road crossing program, the spotted salamander. And I say they're the best mascot, not just because they have tremendously cute big eyes and a mouth that goes from ear to ear, but because they're black and yellow and gray, and they at least remind me of paved roads. But in our North Branch Nature Center candy bar analogies, they are about the size of a Snicker bar. They're quite large, but seldom seen. They've got those yellow spots and that gray-black body, but they're seldom seen because they're fossorial, meaning they live underground or underneath the leaf litter. And even when they do come out on those rainy nights where they might be able to stay moist enough to forage on the leaf litter, they're nocturnal. So these habits of living underground and coming out at night just mean that they're unlikely to run into humans, which is odd. It's because they're common. They're the most common rank, S5. The state conservationists use that for things like robins or birch trees. They're not in any sense uncommon, but we're very unlikely to come across them just because spotted salamanders and humans are living very different lives. But they're very cute, and we're very glad they're here. And you can see from this map, we might have had some, this is a map from 2017. We may have had new records since then, but there are not just records, but photo records in almost every Vermont town. Great, next we have our wood frog, which is about the size of a Reese's peanut butter cup, one of the big ones, not the ones that you get at more stingy trick-or-treating locations. They're brown to beige with that raccoon or bandit mask that goes from their nose to behind their eye. And then another great identifying feature of them is that dorsolateral ridge. There's that fold that goes from their pelvis all the way up to the back of their eye. And different amphibians also have a dorsolateral ridge, but on wood frogs, it's really distinct. They live in the forest, like their name suggests, and they're also eating insects, slugs, snails, spiders, and they're also common. Although humans are a little bit more likely to run into the wood frog because they're not quite so nocturnal, and they also live on top of the leaf litter, then they live above ground, so we're more likely to run into them because of that. And two interesting things about them. One is that their sound, the vocalization they make when they enter these breeding ponds sounds a lot like a quacking duck. Or other people describe it as like two stones hitting each other. And they're very loud. You'll if you start having an ear for amphibians, you'll quickly learn to recognize where wood frogs are hanging out. And then the second fact I have about them is that the Vermont Herpetological Atlas, the folks who keep track of reptiles and amphibians in the state, they are putting a call out to try to find a wood frog in Newport Town. Here on this map, we can see that there's no record in Newport Town, and we know they're there. But we need people to go out and find a wood frog and hopefully take a photo of it in Newport Town. So if any of you are up that way, get to it, or you'll have to try to beat me. It's a little bit of a drive for me, but I want to fill that map in. And these are one of those frogs that have that natural antifreeze they flood their body with, and that allows them to be the most north ranging, the most polar ranging amphibian in the whole world. They're north above the Arctic Circle here in Alaska. and it's really tremendous. It also means that they end up being one of the first amphibians to migrate here in Vermont. Our last character is the four-toed salamander. You're perhaps not as likely to see these. They tend to be a Champlain Valley species, but we include them because they have really fascinating natural history, and they're rare. They're a species of greatest conservation need, S2 ranked. And this ARC program has documented populations of these that we didn't have on the internet before. State biologists might have known of them, but now it's publicly available data, and that's always really cool and exciting. These are our smallest vertebrate in Vermont, the smallest animal with a backbone. They're about the size, excuse me, of a pack of Smarties. And they're this rusty color, and they have this delicate herringbone V-shaped groove running down their back. They also have a distinct white belly with black spots. I've got a great photo of that later in the presentation that we'll see. The last thing I want to call attention to is at the base of their tail, where it meets the body, you can see that kind of cinch point. That is actually the place at which these amphibians might drop their tail. They have the ability to, at will, let go of their tail, and their tail will detach and like squirm around on the ground. And they do that as an anti-predator defense. That squirming tail might distract that raccoon or that opossum, whether it scares them because it's not something they expect, or whether that squirmingness triggers their predatory response, and the raccoon shifts their attention from the crawling salamander to the squirming tail, and they eat that. And the salamander can crawl away at that point, having not become dinner, and they will regrow their tail. But I point that out now because we really want to avoid that happening when we're moving them for conservation or science purposes. The tail does grow back. Amphibians are actually really good at growing back all sorts of different body parts, but it's a huge caloric expense. It could be like a quarter of their body weight. And also the next time they run into a predator, a real predator, they wouldn't have that adaptive response. Great. So that's a little bit of a background on these three characters, these three species. And we're going to talk about three different phases of their life. First, living, where they are as adults after overwintering. Migrating next, that journey from that adult terrestrial habitat in the forest. And then breeding, their eventual goal for spring of returning to these pools and wetlands to make a new generation. So the spotted salamander, like I said, is nocturnal, and it's living right now in rodent burrows and root channels. It's deep underground in these rodent burrows now to avoid winter freezing. But in the summer, as things warm up, they will stay underground for most of the time. They're eating insects, worms, slugs underground for the most part. And that's because, well, they're large and predated upon by, they're eaten by other animals in the forest. Owls have been known to eat them, possums, raccoons. We've had a surveyor on one of these ARC surveys share a photo of a bobcat they saw that was just watching this amphibian crossing. And I'm certain the bobcat was there, not just out of curiosity, but there for dinner. These amphibians are particularly slow moving in the spring when, as cold-blooded animals, they're struggling to metabolize fast enough to move quickly. They're like a really easy free lunch for many animals in the forest. But they're also staying underground and under the leaf litter because they have to stay moist. Their skin is covered in mucus, like the inside of our cheeks. And they use that for chemical perception to sense their surroundings. And also some of them can derive some oxygen through that. But they have to keep moist skin to remain healthy. And while here, those black and yellow spots really stand out against a gravel road, you can see that in their natural habitat on the forest floor with all the different colors of leaves and maple flowers, it can really serve to break up their outline. So it could be cryptic. It could be a camouflage adaptation. Next, we have the wood frog, which is also mostly nocturnal, but it's quite widespread, and you're more likely to see it during the day because they're not living underground. And I will say that they're very cryptic, very well camouflaged. Here you can see that dorsolateral ridge running from that eye to the pelvis, which is a great identifying feature, but it also bears a striking resemblance to like this midrib, that leaf stalk of the oak leaf next to this frog, and that even that black raccoon mask does really imitate shadow well. So they really blend in on the forest floor where they like to live. And I will see them during the summer. I will see them while I'm walking around, but almost all the time I hear them first rather than seeing. As I'm stepping, I'll hear a noise close to my feet that didn't sound like it was caused by my actual foot. And if you freeze and you look around and you watch, maybe you'll see one of these shaded eyes staring back at you. The last one I'll kind of breeze through because there's not a ton in your region, but there are some in your region. The four-toed salamander. These are our tiniest salamanders, and they really love forested wetlands. They're a little more acid tolerant, not to like pollution acid, but they're more tolerant of naturally occurring acidic soils. So they're more likely to live in mixed hardwoods that have some more acidic soil, or soil that has been made more acidic through conifers. And here's some different photos of what good habitat looks like. And as these are rare, it's really nice to learn about new populations and report those. So this is definitely one that if you do see, we ask for photos of them with your survey, but it's also great to put it on iNaturalist. And we end up putting some of those photos on iNaturalist as a way to report this to conservationists quickly. So returning now to that diagram of where our amphibians are now, let's think about this in terms of what it means for migration. So before any migration happens, the snow has to melt. At least the snow has to melt on top of the individual amphibians. As long as there's snow, they're packed in ice. They're not going to be waking up. They're not going to be metabolizing. They're not going to be producing energy or heat or moving their body at all. But on here outside my window in Montpelier, I can see some sunny bare spots, which could be enough to wake up these spring peepers and these wood frogs that are right on top of the soil or right underneath a couple leaves. And once they start moving, if they were to hop onto snow, their body temperature could quickly fall to the point at which they're moving very slowly again. So we tend to say that migration starts to happen once nights are above 40 degrees, and it's also very important for it to be rainy. As we think about it though, these amphibians, the frogs on top of the soil, are much more responsive to those like few bright sunny days, warm days, early warm days like we might have this week, than the salamanders that are further underground. They're just so insulated by that 4, 8, 10 feet of soil that it really takes some infiltration of rainwater to get the warm temperatures and those signs for migration all the way down. So to summarize, we think, and to be honest here, is people, not just myself personally, but like people, researchers don't have a great, perfect understanding of what it is that cues this migration. And we have logicked it to like these obvious things. It's increasing soil temperature, increasing air temperature, melting snowpack in the first spring rains. And it's very difficult to beforehand put that all together into a forecast. Some groups can do it for very local places, but I know that a south-facing aspect in this town will probably have migration occurring 3 weeks before a shady hollow on a north-facing slope. But regardless of how confusing the cues can be for us, it really appears that the salamanders, these amphibians, are all sort of reading the same forecasts and feeling the same things, because this study from 2003, they followed spotted salamanders the year before to their burrows and then tagged them and tracked them on the way back. And they found that they were all, 90% of them were returning to that vernal pool in just over 5 days. So it's really like a startlingly synchronous event, sort of like sleep and you'll miss it. So definitely get out on those first nights where it feel like it might be a big night. But at the same time, you know, there's 10% that might drag on. So I've definitely seen times where there was maybe a big night, great weather for it at the beginning of April. And then if it's dry, if it's not raining, especially not raining at night, for the next 3 weeks even, you could have another big night at the end of the month. And this migration can happen for over a quarter mile in this study, going through woods, fields, clear cuts, and even over roads to reach breeding pools. Now, the two lives of salamanders really call for two habitats: that aquatic habitat where they're breeding and living as young, and that terrestrial habitat, those woods where they're living under the leaf litter and eating all sorts of insects as adults. And I present this as sort of like the ideal arrangement of those, where you have like you have like no development and you have great access from the wetland for the larval population and breeding to the upland forests for the adults. And I say almost perfect because this wetland does look too big to me. That looks like a wetland that is wet all year round and can have fish. And fish, amphibians' whole thing, salamanders' whole thing is being the metaphorical big fish in a little pond. And once there are literal fish in your literal pond, any amphibian very quickly becomes lunch. Fish are amazing predators of anything that swims, particularly amphibians, because while they can swim, they're not swimming as fast as a fish. So the real star of amphibian breeding is the vernal pool, and there are a lot of different definitions for them, but like the one common between any place that you'll learn about them is that they dry up sometimes. It could be every year during some point of the year in the summer, or it could be every couple of years. But the important part is that they dry up, which would kill all the fish. If your pool is drying, you don't have fish. If you don't have fish, you're an amazing place to live and reproduce as a frog or as a salamander. They're also rich because of that in a lot of different things: insects, fairy shrimp, fingernail clams, and because of that, they're like phenomenally important wildlife habitat. And the Vermont Center for Eco Studies does a project that this figure on the right is pulled from. This is the Vernal Pool Atlas project, and they mapped thousands of these potential vernal pools. All the orange dots are potential vernal pools. And then the other different colors are ones that are either currently being monitored or have been visited and confirmed. So they always need help visiting these potential vernal pools just to confirm that, yes, there's water here. Yes, it seems to dry up. Yes, there are characteristic amphibians, there are characteristic invertebrates here, so that those can be noted as wetlands and protected. Permanent wetlands in the state are very well protected. Like large developments can't like fill in a swamp. Like that is illegal. But vernal pools don't have that protection, or it's much more difficult for them to have that protection, because if like a state biologist goes there in August, it's not a wetland. It's just a grassy patch that is slightly lower than the rest. But that might have been really essential breeding habitat for a four-toed salamander just a couple months before. But because they dry up, it's harder to protect them. So the Vernal Pool Atlas, run by the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, is another great way to get involved at any time of the year, and something that the state really relies on for conservation planning. So this is what a vernal pool looks like. And it might look like a glorified puddle, but if you're an amphibian who is terrified of fish, they are not just a glorified puddle, they are a glorious puddle. And here we have a bit of a timeline of what an actual vernal pool looks like. These are all taken from the same angle at the same pool. You can see this log across it in the foreground in each of them. And I think the one on the furthest left is what we're kind of looking at right now. And as spring progresses, snowmelt and rainfall will start to fill it up, and the ice will retreat. And you'll start to see spring peepers and wood frogs returning at about this time. But the real true like key hot time for amphibian reproduction is this, when it's at its maximum extent, ice and snow are gone, and rainwater has really filled this vernal pool up. So that's when all these amphibians are congregating to breed in these vernal pools. And then as spring goes on, some of this water infiltrates into the groundwater, some of it evaporates, some of it is taken up by plants. As summer goes on, the pool gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And a really fascinating thing is that as this deadline for these amphibians is approaching, for them to grow legs and grow lungs and move onto land, they're really actually helped by that shrinking of the vernal pool. As it shrinks, its temperature increases, and as cold-blooded animals, that means that these amphibians, their metabolic rate increases. So as that deadline of like all the water drying up approaches, they're growing faster and faster and faster, and then they're able to grow legs, grow lungs, and move out of these temporary wetlands. So for breeding, that what will be happening here in a couple weeks, maybe a month, where y'all are, that spotted salamander males, they emerge about the same time, but males tend to be the leading front of spotted salamander migration, because they're getting there, they're arriving at the vernal pools, and they swim to the bottom of the pool, and they make a little mucus pedestal about that tall. It's white, and on top of it, they'll put what's called a spermatophore. It's an orb of mucus and sperm on top of that pedestal. And we've got a video here of what a congress, a great gathering of spotted salamanders looks like. So this was actually seen at an ARC site while someone was doing a road crossing survey. They like peeked into the ditch and they found like hundreds of these salamanders. So these, oh yeah, great. Oh, I want to play that again. So these spotted salamanders are all congregating. They're making their mucus pedestal. They're laying their spermatophores. And then the males actually compete for female attention. They'll do like a little salamander dance, being like, look how good my genes are. Look how strong my genes make a salamander. And we have one coming right at the camera here. And they'll do that until they attract the attention of a female. And then they'll take that female, they'll lead that female to their particular mucus pedestal with their particular spermatophore. And if the female accepts, she'll crawl over the floor of the vernal pool and like navigate that spermatophore into herself, where it will fertilize up to 100 eggs. And these eggs are about, oh, we have another one here I'm gonna play while I talk. These eggs are about the size, after they're laid, they're about the size of like a large raspberry. And if you think of an animal the size of a Snickers bar, it's hard to imagine 100 of these raspberries in that female. And the case is that they're much smaller when they're in the female. They're dehydrated basically. And then when they come in contact with the pond water, then they swell up like tapioca or boba tea. It does, I'm not sure sound works here, but there's great spring peepers and wood frogs in the background of this video. But wood frogs are another one of our characters. They're the first frogs to call in the spring as this like really like near Arctic species, and they're explosive breeders. The males will grab onto the female's back, and they'll float in the middle of the pool as that female ejects up to 1,000 eggs that can either be hooked to vegetation or just floating around in the middle of the pool. And sometimes these one wood frog will have an egg mass but then other wood frogs all around them will form egg masses, and they'll all attach into a raft that can be 10, 20, 50 feet across. And this is another time where in the spotted salamanders, we had the males having like evolutionary advantage for getting there early. Those first males can like get a good spot and know that they're there and present to compete for female attention. For the wood frogs, not only is it competing for mates, it's having your eggs laid early means that you get to be in the middle of this raft of like thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs, which means that when the raccoon inevitably finds this delicious smorgasbord of eggs in the vernal pool, they start eating at the edge of it, not at the center. So those frog eggs in the center that were there first are more likely to survive. Last, we have the four-toed salamander, which, this is one of my favorite parts of the four-toed salamander. The eggs of the wood frog and the spotted salamander are like jelly-like and the size of raspberries. They're covered in goo and they're laid in pools. And that's the default state of amphibians. They need water to reproduce. This was the default state of terrestrial life at one point. Terrestrial life on land came out of the ocean, and when it did, it still needed water to reproduce. It wasn't until reptiles and birds evolved, which is long after amphibians, that there was access to reproduction on dry land. An egg shell, that hard shell of an egg, is what allows it to not need moisture. Now, the four-toed salamander has sort of adapted in that way. They, instead of laying 1,000 eggs in the dangerous vernal pool where they can be eaten by dragonfly larvae, they can be eaten by leeches, they can be eaten by raccoons, they could be eaten by all these things in this really exposed spot in the vernal pool. The four-toed salamander instead is laying just like 4 or 8 or 10 eggs. But they're laying them in sphagnum moss, in wet sphagnum moss, because they still need that moisture, but they've evolved to lay them on land where they're further away from all those risks of predation that are inherent in reproducing in a vernal pool. But they have to be right next to the pool, or even better, overhanging the pool, because when these eggs hatch, the larval salamanders are like that big, and they want to just be able to like plop into the water where they can go eat like nearly microscopic invertebrates, and then grow. So we have now bred, and we're hopefully in a pond, in a wetland that's smaller than this and less full of fish than this. But this is the great arrangement I was saying, of having that adult terrestrial habitat, those woods habitats right next to the wetland breeding habitat. But unfortunately, on the Vermont landscape, it's often the case that our nice wetland habitat is separated from our nice forest habitat by a road. And unfortunately, that can lead to some car collisions. And these spotted salamanders in particular can live up to a decade, and they're pretty slow to reach sexual maturity. And while 100 eggs a year sounds like a lot from our perspective, it's actually like quite slow reproductive rate for smaller animals. So just having like 10% mortality, 10% of amphibians being struck by cars or otherwise killed during migration can lead to extirpation, that local extinction of a population. So that's where we come in, the Amphibian Road Crossing Program, this community science program that North Branch and partner organizations promote and organize to get folks out and involved in this. And this program that I'll key you into in the next couple of minutes has 4 goals. The first is just to increase public engagement in amphibian conservation. So all of us here, find a gold star, pin it to your chest. We've done it. We're publicly engaged in amphibian conservation. And it's hard. The birds get a lot of credit. Moose are really charismatic. Everyone loves bears as long as they're not in their backyard. We're super happy to have 29 people in a Zoom room being excited about conserving amphibians. Our second goal is to just directly decrease amphibian mortality at road crossing sites. Anytime that we can prevent an amphibian from being squished, that's a win for the surveyor, that's a win for the amphibian, that's a win for state biodiversity. And then third, we want to be able to get data at the state level to inform transportation planning. The reality is that a lot of transportation planning and transportation funding happens at the state level. It's VTrans who is putting in roads and culverts, not necessarily the local conservation commission. And by being able to say, like, not just there are some amphibians crossing here, but this site is exceptionally high in amphibian crossing and exceptionally high in mortality, you can match those state level funding to state level conservation efforts. And then fourth, we want to make sure that this state biodiversity data is available for conservation research. Like, there are a lot of birders out there counting birds, and that's been tremendously helpful for bird conservation. There are fewer people out there counting amphibians. They're harder to count because they're not flying through the air and singing at us all the time. And we're really excited to be able to provide this data product to state conservationists. And I should say, iNaturalist is probably the place where most amphibian records are in the state. There are 21,000 when I checked earlier this week. And right now, the Amphibian Road Crossing Program, which just started in 2018, is at like 18,000. So I'm hoping, it's not a competition, but I'm hoping if we have a good spring, we'll get that #1 spot. And folks like at the state and at Vermont Center for Eco Studies are really excited to have our data and to put it in the international research community. Great. So this is what some successes could look like. So yes, we could have amphibian specific migration structures, but it can also just be the case that, like, when a new culvert goes in, and like funding is like starting to appear for this, especially with like large like federal dollars being spent on infrastructure projects, a bigger culvert can mean better wildlife crossing. And then on the left, this salamander migration road closing is like actually a little disingenuous, because roads wouldn't even have to be closed in daylight hours. They just have to be closed at night when it's raining, like a couple times in April. And we're starting to have actually some success with this, or like people are starting to talk about it down in Hartford, where folks have been involved in this amphibian road crossing program and like getting on their conservation commission and talking to people and like finding ways where like it would just make a lot of sense. And it's pretty easy for people to coexist with this migration. And then, of course, this project, this is a like very expensive, very cool road crossing structure, and it actually predates this project, but it's a phenomenal example. And like VTrans is very, very proud of it. There's some really cute interviews with the folks who built this road. But this is what a wildlife crossing structure could look like. Here on the left, you see the wetland habitat, and on the right side of the road is the upland habitat, the woods, where the amphibians would migrate to after breeding. So the way this works is that an amphibian coming out of the swamp would hit the cement wall, and if they turned left, they'd end up back in the swamp and they'd try again. And if on their second try they turned right, they'd be guided along this wall, and then this 2x8 would guide them through this tunnel safely under the road to the other side. And this is actual footage. You can see all these black dots. Each of these is a new photo taken every minute at this underpass in Moncton. And you can see it's just hundreds, it's thousands of salamanders crossing on a big night. And this was put in here because this was one of those places where, like, yeah, they didn't have good data, but like it was mind-boggling the number of amphibians that were being road killed here. So we hope to be able to put these in less obvious places than this place in Moncton that was just like infamous for really gruesome sites. And of course, we're focused on amphibians, but this crossing site, this wildlife crossing structure has led to bears, possums, raccoons, bobcats, all sorts of different animals use it. Great. Great. So how do you get involved? Here we have some great techniques being demonstrated. This young person is doing great frog holding technique, a gentle hand cupped below, and then very importantly, a hand on top to prevent hopping out. I will say, I guess they're probably very short, but I like to carry my hands low to the ground in case if there was an escapee, if the frog was to wiggle its way out, I want it to have a short way to fall to the ground. And then these fingers are presenting to us that beautiful black and white speckled belly of a four-toed salamander with great four-toed salamander holding technique, staying away from that tail that it might detach with predator avoidance instinct. So to get involved, step one is to visit, go to northbranchnaturecenter.org/amphibian conservation. If you remember anything, go there, go to our website. It has all the information you need. And then step one is to view our crossing map. I'm going to do that right now. So here's our website. It looks like this. We've got a great spotted salamander staring at you. And you can click here to find our map, and that will pull up this. And you can see, you can scroll around and find all sorts of different sites, many of them up by y'all. And then if you zoom in, I'm going to go to one of my favorite sites over here. If you zoom in, as you get closer and closer, a pink line appears. That is the actual start and end of the section. And as you zoom in further, you might be able to recognize the driveways it's on. If you click on the dot, it will tell you a lot of details. One of which, if you scroll down, is the site description, which will tell you exactly where it starts and stops. So this goes from Route 12 northwest to 139 Shady Rail Road. So you would park here at the intersection. There's a nice pull off. And then you'd start doing your survey until you saw the sign 139 Shady Rail Road right here. There's more information on these pop-ups too. This will tell you it's low survey priority just because people have been there before. We might change that at some point, but we just want to know, we really want to fill in all these gaps where you see these red sites no one has been to yet. So we haven't fully confirmed that there's amphibian migration going on there. But what's great about sites, I like to go to sites that have been surveyed before, because what's great about it is I can see that 5 species are known here. They're spotted salamanders, my favorite, newts, wood frogs, spring peepers, American toad, and they're like 25 amphibians per hour. Like, you get a salamander every minute or two. And you also record how much traffic you see. So this is a great example where here there are 15 cars per hour, and then here one that's monitored much less frequently. There's 41.5 cars per hour. This road, Elmore Road, Route 12, is very busy. So like having these two side by side allows people to choose choose if they want a quieter road, and it's a little safer that way with less traffic, or they want a busy road where the amphibians might be in more danger. But I find myself going going to dirt roads with a lot less traffic. And this information allows you to choose your own adventure that way. Okay. So once you know your site, you zoom in, see that pink line in the site description to understand where your transect starts and ends. You go out on those rainy nights during early spring. We say nights after April 1st, where it's about 40 degrees or greater, and it's raining. And you want it to have been raining for maybe half an hour or more. And then you you want to park before you get to the pink line, because the pink line is where we think there might be amphibians crossing. You don't want to be a car that's potentially squishing them. So park, get to the start of your transect, and then you're recording different things. You're recording how much rain there is, cars that are passing by, temperature, and then the number of live and dead amphibians as you go along. And we do ask that folks remove the roadkill amphibians. We suggest that people bring a spatula that they plan to never use again for food, to actually flip those roadkill amphibians off. First, so you don't have to touch salamander guts, but also like it actually adds some leverage. And we really want people to remove them like far from the road, because that roadkill amphibian is like an enticing food item for scavengers, and we don't want bears, raccoons, possums, all these scavengers to be like crows, ravens, to be like further endangered of becoming roadkill themselves. So we ask them to be removed. It also helps you not count them twice. We don't want to double count anything to keep our data accurate. So you count all those things, remove the roadkill amphibians as you go to the end of your transect. Then when you reach the end of your transect, turn your data sheet over and then repeat the same thing on the way back. So a typical night out would be one pass there, filling out the data sheet, turn it over, fill another data sheet out on the way back. And these transects tend to be about the same size. And we ask that people do them in passes, recording a new data set every time so that we can do apples to apples comparison across it. That's the power of our data. It's standard methods across the whole state. And like a lot of people are doing it. Last year we had like 3,500 amphibian records with like 300 volunteers. Like no academic lab, no PhD biologist, even with like National Science Foundation funding, could get together 250 field technicians for like a couple random nights in April to cover the whole state. This is really like priceless data for transportation and biodiversity planning. And like the root of it, the utility of it relies on people really like, it's just that they do one transect, they go out, and then they fill out the data sheet on the back. And I'll be honest, there's sometimes when I'm like overwhelmed with amphibians, it's a great night when they're like 100 spotted salamanders, where I'll stop recording data, and that's okay. But like, just stop recording data. It's great to report as much data as you can, but we really do want it to be apples to apples. So in those cases where I'm just overwhelmed with salamanders, I'll record data for a pass or two, and then put the data aside and like enjoy what I'm doing and like be in practice of removing these amphibians from the road, but like recognize that it's no longer apples to apples. So I'm not submitting that data. Great. So like for big nights, yeah, do it as a transect, do it as a big group. And like, yeah, you can say here on the data sheet, number of people in your party, 30. Hopefully you have 30 people going together, but you're doing it all as one big pass. That sounds like a great time. I might have to come up and join. But yeah, and then once you have your data, you come back and you could, all the data needs to be submitted online. You can do it on your phone or do it on our website at the link at the bottom of the spreadsheet or the data sheet. And it's just a Google form. And this allows us to see the data quickly. It allows us to like ask questions about it or ask for photos. I can't wait to get some data that includes a wood frog from Newport Town, so I can let all those folks at the Vermont Herp Atlas know that we've found it. We found the wood frog that we know is already in Newport. Great. And then congratulate yourself for helping amphibians. Yeah. The last thing I have to say is a couple of notes on safety. For the amphibians, we want folks to have clean, asterisk. Clean means not washed with like soap or hand sanitizer, but free of chemicals. It means like don't be eating flaming hot Cheetos. These amphibians are covered in a mucous membrane. So basically, if something would hurt if it went into your eyes, it would feel uncomfortable for the amphibian. So keep your hands clean or covered in mud, wet and low to the ground. Handle the amphibians only when necessary. If they're 90% of the way across the road, nothing's coming, you can let them keep going. Or if you want to like hang out with the first spotted salamander for a while, rather than hold it in your hands, put it in a Tupperware, take your photos in the Tupperware. And like, I've had, yeah, they won't be stressed out if they're briefly held in a small container, they will be stressed out being like actively held that whole time. And I will also say that I think it is necessary if you're out with a child who's never seen a giant spotted salamander, like it's necessary to like establish that connection with them. I think a huge power of this program is getting lots of people impressed and connected with these like really wild creatures that are in our backyards. Are common, but we don't see that often. Once you understand that these roadside puddles are really important habitat for something that you truly care about, then like our conservation commissions like really will kick butt, and our local environmental nonprofits will be really well supported, and we'll be doing great. And then some notes on safety for humans. Really, I can't stress this enough: wear reflective clothing. Flashlight etiquette means like maybe like look at the car when it's coming, but then turn your flashlights and headlamps to yourself so you're well illuminated. And even better, just step off the road. Be wearing rain boots and be like really ready to jump off the road, because it's at night. It might be 1 in the morning on a dirt road. The visibility tends to be bad, and people aren't expecting to run into humans on these roads. Yeah, that's about it. The bucket can be really nice for those days where you see 50 spotted salamanders at a time. I've seen it in our data. People are running into 50 spotted salamanders, and they're moving them by the bucket load. But yeah, great. At this point, I'd love to open up for questions. You're welcome to drop them in the chat or raise your hand and come off mute. Great.
Hi there, it's Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. What's your question?
Couple questions. On your map, I noticed that you had 2 places in Thetford. You've changed the spot, the locations.
Oh,
since from 2 weeks ago.
In Thetford.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any? Can you follow up with me via email?
Sure.
Great. I am the person who moves all of these around, but I'm not. I don't necessarily remember what I do during the day. Great. I'll follow up with Catherine via email. Does anyone have any other questions? Lindsay, you want to come off?
Yeah. Pete, last year we wore gloves, rubber gloves. Is that a no-go?
Yeah. No, that's fine. That's great. Yeah. I mean, like, that's great amphibian care. They're single-use plastic, but like,
yeah,
that means you don't have to worry about having had spicy Cheetos earlier that day. Yeah. Cool. Here's some of our year-end stats from last year. It wasn't our best year. I think one year we topped 5,000 amphibians counted, but it can kind of be the case where, like, depending on when the rain comes, our worst year so far was a year where all the rain that spring happened between the hours of like 3 and 5 a.m. So the amphibians were moving, but the humans were like very much sleeping. But we're hoping for some human compatible precipitation this year. Cool. Great. Great.
I do have one more.
Yeah.
I think it was 2 years ago we encountered a wood frog that I assume was very full of eggs.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to check if that was a thing. She was
So the female amphibians are massive. Sometimes when they're going into these pools, they're just huge. I think this photo, you can like kind of tell with spotted salamanders, like this one on the bottom, that's a female. She's super gravid. And that one on the top might be a male. There are resources available online. I don't tend to do much with their sex, but there are resources available online to differentiate the sexes. Well, what I do every time I see a spotted salamander at a couple of my favorite sites here, I take a photo of them and put it on INAT, because these spots actually are like our thumbprints, and you might be able to uniquely identify them. So each year I have a lot of fun going through all of my previous records of spotted salamanders at the site behind my house to see if I can start to recognize one. Cool. Well, there are no other questions. Might stop the recording. And out of respect for people's time, end this. I have a whole list of questions from the from a high school class, but I think I covered a lot of them. Oh, the one I didn't get to is, can humans eat amphibians? Were amphibians used as food for early humans? And the answer is yes, amphibians can be eaten. Frog legs are a delicacy in some parts of the world. And I think probably, well, a lot of amphibians, particularly salamanders, have some toxins in their skins. But I think a lot of the answer too is that we don't know. A lot of the foodways of this region of the indigenous people here have been lost and are being reclaimed. And I don't know of anyone who's eating amphibians now, but it could have happened before. But yeah, they're definitely favorite snacks for a lot of animals out there. Great.
I'm not finding your email.
Okay, right. Contact information. So to stay in contact with us, you can get signed up on our website or at the link that Lindsay shared, and then get out on those rainy nights in April. All of this information is available at northbranchnaturecenter.org/amphibian conservation. I'm also doing a talk here at the Nature Center tomorrow at 7 if you want a reprise. The recording of this will be sent out to you all. And you can also contact me at pete@northbranchnaturecenter.org. The info account will get to me via some forwarding, but pete@northbranchnaturecenter.org is my email. I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you.
Long email. Great. All right, well, I'm going to turn the recording off and then end the meeting. Thanks all of you for your attention and for coming out tonight.